This video is sponsored by Squarespace. These days, the cinematic landscape of blockbuster movies has become utterly dominated by the superhero genre. On the big screen, Marvel's interconnected universe of films is the most successful movie franchise ever made, and DC's looser connected standalone efforts continue to take bold creative risks with their characters. But it's arguable this era of superhero dominance never would have happened if not for a film released way back in 1978. Clark Kent, aka Superman, made his debut in 1938 in Action Comics #1. The character was truly the first of his kind. While mythology was already replete with superhumans and comic books were already filled with pulp heroes, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's creation was the first true superhero. The character was an instant smash hit, eventually getting his own dedicated solo comic the following year. It wasn't long before the character leapt off the page and into other mediums, such as the radio show The Adventures of Superman, which invented kryptonite, the Fleischer Superman cartoons, which invented his flying ability, as well as the Kirk Alyn and George Reeves live-action serials and TV show. Thanks to Superman's success in these forms, and his and other superheroes playing a part in World War II morale boosting, the character had gone from a comic book power fantasy to an American cultural icon. Despite this pop cultural status, however, few saw potential in a big screen, big budget Superman feature film. One who did though was Ilya Salkind. Ilya's father, Alexander Salkind, was a seasoned movie mogul at this point in time. The Salkinds had found great success producing historical epics like The Daughter of the Regiment, Austerlitz, and Cervantes, drama films like Orson Welles' The Trial, as well as adventure films like The Light at the Edge of the World, The Three Musketeers, and its sequel, The Four Musketeers. Alexander Salkind had little knowledge or interest in Superman, and in truth his son Ilya had only a general familiarity with the character. However, Ilya saw great potential in bringing Superman to the big screen. He pitched to his father the idea of bringing the scope of the lavish European epics they had already produced to a cultural icon like Superman, and Alexander Salkind agreed the picture could be a huge hit. Warner Brothers, however, who had already bought DC Comics by this point, didn't agree, and in 1974 a long and intensive round of negotiations began for the Salkinds to acquire the film rights for the character. Part of negotiations was DC's demand to see a full list of potential actors who the Salkinds were considering for the lead role. This list included Muhammad Ali, Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, James Caan, Steve McQueen, and Clint Eastwood, among many others. Eventually, the Salkinds were successful in securing the rights in a negative pickup deal. However, due to the expected expense of the production and the arduous process of securing the rights, the Salkinds decided to shoot not one but two Superman movies back to back. To write the film, Ilya Salkind initially hired acclaimed science fiction author Alfred Bester. However, he only got as far as a rough treatment before Alexander Salkind demanded they hire a superstar writer to lend the production some legitimacy. Thus, the producers hired Godfather screenwriter Mario Puzo. While Puzo began work on the script, the Salkinds went in search of a director to helm the project. Among those considered were Francis Ford Coppola, William Friedkin, Sam Peckinpah, and George Lucas. Negotiations either fell through or the directors were committed elsewhere, such as George Lucas's commitments to Star Wars. Ilya Salkind championed Steven Spielberg, and his father was convinced following the release of Jaws, but he too was committed to other projects like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Eventually, the producers succeeded in hiring Guy Hamilton, famous for directing a number of James Bond movies. Hamilton was hugely enthusiastic about the project, and began filming test footage for the elaborate special and visual effects. Meanwhile, the Salkinds had started casting the film, and as with the writer and director, the producers wanted some big names to lend the production further legitimacy. At the time, Marlon Brando was one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, and the Salkinds believed if they could land an actor of his power, then other stars would be lining up to join the project. Negotiations with Brando to play Superman's father Jor-El were difficult and demanding, with the actor eventually securing a $3.7 million salary, as well as a cut of the box office as well. This was an astronomically high payday at the time, for what would be an incredibly short amount of screen time. But with Brando on board, the production ran into some difficulties. The Salkinds had originally planned to shoot the film in Italy at the famous Cinecittà Studios in Rome. However, Brando couldn't shoot in Italy as he was wanted on an obscenity charge following the release of Last Tango in Paris. Therefore, the production was relocated to England at Pinewood Studios. This meant losing Guy Hamilton as director though, as he was wanted for tax evasion and so had to drop out. Mark Robson, known for directing the disaster movie Earthquake, was briefly considered as a replacement, but eventually the producers became interested in director Richard Donner, following his helming of the hit horror film The Omen.
I was on the John, the phone rings, and this funny little voice says, "We're making the movie Superman, and I want to know if you want to direct." He said, "I'll give you $1 million. I said, "Well, give me some information." And I'd written it down on a little tiny card that was in the bathroom, and I wrote down on the back of it, $1 million. And I wrote Gene Hackman, Marlon Brando, and Superman. That card today is still, it's the most important card of my life.
This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the ultimate tool for creating your own beautiful website. I recently redesigned my website galaxyclasspictures.com using Squarespace's cutting-edge design tools like Blueprint AI, which helped me generate a brand new personalized template, which I then customized using Squarespace's easy-to-use Fluid engine. Squarespace also helps with your site's discoverability with their built-in SEO and domain name features. You can optimize your website so it shows up more often in searches and secure your ideal domain name. No extra fees and no add-ons required. Jump over to Squarespace using the link below to start building your website and use the coupon code Rowan J. Coleman to get 10% off your first purchase. Donner, unlike Hamilton, was a huge Superman fan, having read many of the comics as a child. He was happy to accept the gargantuan task of directing both movies, but first he had to make a few changes. First of which was retooling Mario Puzo's script, which was over 550 pages long. Donner recalled, "They had prepared the picture for a year and not one bit was useful to me. You can't shoot this screenplay because you'll be shooting for 5 years. That was literally a shooting script and they planned to shoot all 500 pages. You know, 110 pages is plenty for a script, so even for 2 features, that was way too much." Donner brought on Tom Mankiewicz to rewrite the script from scratch. However, due to the Writers Guild of America's regulations, Donner could only credit Mankiewicz as a creative consultant. Among other things, Mankiewicz was the one who conceived of the idea of Krypton having noble houses, symbolized by a unique crest, with Superman's famous S being the crest for the House of L, and so on. Donner also hired production designer John Barry, cinematographer Jeffrey Unsworth, and editor Stuart Baird, as well as many in the special and visual effects teams. Donner's mandate for all the department heads was verisimilitude, meaning the appearance of being true or real. Their goal was to make the fantastical world of Superman feel as believable to the audience as possible. Donner's efforts in energizing the production crew also helped him handle the cast. As the start of shooting approached, Marlon Brando, in a meeting with Donner and Ilya Salkind, famously suggested playing Jor-El as either a talking green suitcase or a bagel.
I mean, I said, this is it. This man is completely nuts. I was completely petrified.
I said, "You know, Marlon, there isn't a kid from 6 to my age that doesn't know what Jor-El looks like." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The comic book's around since '39. He said, "Okay, show me what I look like." I showed him, and from there on in, he was a doll.
Paul Newman was offered the role of Lex Luthor and Superman, but turned both down. After Marlon Brando was on board, however, Gene Hackman pursued the villainous role. With hits like The Poseidon Adventure, The Conversation, and A Bridge Too Far under his belt, Hackman had exactly the kind of star power the Salkinds were looking for, and so he was cast as Lex Luthor. With 2 big names on board, production was ramping up, but the film was still yet to find its lead.
"It's all over, Luthor. You're coming with me."
We were looking in every corner of the earth for another candidate to play Superman.
The Salkinds continued to favour American movie stars like Robert Redford and Paul Newman. However, casting director Lynn Stallmaster soon came to Donner and the Salkinds with the name of a 24-year-old Christopher Reeve. Christopher Reeve, a graduate of the renowned Juilliard acting school, had just started to break into screen acting in the mid-1970s, having landed a role in the soap opera Love of Life and later a bit part in the naval submarine thriller Grey Lady Down. However, his most acclaimed work was on Broadway in plays like A Matter of Gravity, where he became close friends with the legendary Katharine Hepburn. It was while acting the play My Life with William Hurt that he was told he was being considered for Superman. Stylemaster had put Reeves' picture in front of Donner and the Salkinds 3 separate times, and each time they moved him to the bottom of the pile for being too unknown and too skinny. But over time, Stylemaster was able to convince them to give Reeve a shot at a screen test.
He hopped off the balcony and said, "Good evening, Miss Lane," because the tone was just right. The thing, and he went through the test and we knew we had him.
Instantly, the team was convinced Reeve was the perfect man for the job, and with Warner Brothers' approval, he was cast as Superman. Reeves' approach for the Clark Kent side of the character was largely inspired by Cary Grant's performance in Bringing Up Baby, only more bumbling and with an added stutter. For his performance as Superman, he essentially let the costume do the work and underplayed the character, eschewing the need to puff his chest or pose dramatically. He recalled, "By the late 1970s, the masculine image had changed. Now it was acceptable for a man to show gentleness and vulnerability. I felt that the new Superman ought to reflect that contemporary male image." To get in shape for the role, the producers hired David Prowse, the famous bodybuilder who played Darth Vader in the original Star Wars, to train Reeve for the role. To play the young Clark Kent in Smallville, the producers cast Jeff East, albeit in heavy prosthetic makeup to closer resemble Christopher Reeve. Initially, East used his real voice in the scenes, but was later dubbed over by Reeve without his knowledge. This was something which apparently greatly upset the actor at the time. Among those considered for the crucial role of Lois Lane were Leslie Ann Warren and Ann Archer, who both screen tested with Christopher Reeve. But it was Margot Kidder who immediately won over Richard Donner.
Margot is a klutz, a born accident waiting to happen.
It was quite a project with Margot, but her charm shined through and made her very lovable, very adorable. And audiences really responded, I think.
To fill out the other roles of the Daily Planet were Mark McClure, known for Freaky Friday and I Wanna Hold Your Hand, and the legendary Jackie Cooper as Perry White, who was a last-minute replacement in the role after the original actor Keenan Wynn suffered a heart attack. Completing Lex Luthor's gang of criminals were Ned Beatty as Otis and Valerie Perrine as Miss Teschmacher. Meanwhile, Glenn Ford was cast as Jonathan Kent, and Phyllis Thaxter was cast as Martha Kent, though in the film they are only credited simply as Pa and Ma Kent. Back on Krypton, Susanna York was cast as Superman's mother, Lara L., though only credited as Lara. To play the evil Kryptonian insurrectionists, Terrence Stamp was cast as General Zod, Sarah Douglas as Ursa, and Jack O'Halloran as Non. With the cast finally in place, studio and location secure, and a promising start to the special effects work, filming began on the 28th of March, 1977. The scope of principal photography was enormous. Shooting the two movies back to back would eventually take 19 months, and 11 units shooting simultaneously across 3 continents with over 1,000 crew members. It's no surprise then that Superman became the most expensive film production in movie history at the time. Filming began at Pinewood Studios, where the Fortress of Solitude and related Krypton sets were built at the famous 007 soundstage, and even spilled over into Shepperton Studios. Production designer John Barry researched the Superman comics, and found a preoccupation with the crystal motif related to the famous varieties of kryptonite. He suggested to Donner this crystal motif be expanded to all Krypton-related settings, making the fortress and the interiors on Krypton all resemble the inside of crystals. Donner loved the idea, which also inspired costume designer Yvonne Blake to create something which would give the Kryptonians an almost angelic quality. She sourced a material from the company 3M, which built cinema screens. It was a highly reflective material made out of thousands upon thousands of minuscule glass balls. After the costume department spent weeks sewing these glass balls into the costumes, they would be lit by bouncing a white light onto them, creating a bright glowing effect. While filming the Krypton scenes, Marlon Brando was famously lazy, refusing to learn lines and instead reading them off cue cards and even off baby Superman's nappy. He even admitted to not having actually read the full script.
On the first day, I came onto the set, and then he said, have you read this? I said, yeah. I said, haven't you read it, Marlon? No, I haven't read it. I said, Marlon, why haven't you read it? Well, it might be crap, and I need the money, so I haven't read it.
Though apparently after he did read it, Brando was immensely supportive of the film, using every opportunity to sing its praises to the press. For the Metropolis scenes, the production moved to New York City, where the New York Daily News building stood in for the Daily Planet. During filming, the city suffered a major blackout, and cinematographer Jeffrey Unsworth joked that it must have been his fault due to the amount of lighting equipment he had plugged in at the time. The production also moved up to Alberta, Canada, which stood in for all of the Smallville scenes. Warner Brothers was very encouraged by the footage they were seeing of the film and expanded their distribution arrangement to include all foreign distribution rather than just North America. They also gave the production an extra $20 million when costs ran over budget in exchange for the television rights. While Warner Brothers was extremely excited by the film, the reality of the shoots was much more contentious. Richard Donner clashed harshly with the Salkinds, and in particular their longtime producing partner Pierre Spengler. Fierce arguments broke out almost on a daily basis concerning the escalating budget and production schedule.
Dick never, in the course of the picture, got a budget. He never got a schedule. He was constantly told that he was over schedule, way over budget, but nobody told him what that budget was or how much he was over that budget. And at one point he said, why don't you just schedule the rest of the film for 2 days and I'll be 9 months over.
The relationship between Donner and the producers became so bad they could no longer speak to each other, and director Richard Lester, who had worked with the Salkinds on the 3 and 4 Musketeers, was brought in as a mediator. While Lester and Donner got on much better, his presence still resulted in a lot of tension during production. Donner recalled, he'd been suing the Salkinds for his money on 3 and 4 Musketeers, which he'd never gotten. He won a lot of his lawsuits, but each time he sued the Salkinds in one country, they'd move to another, from Costa Rica to Panama to Switzerland. When I was hired, Lester told me, don't do it, don't work for them. I was told not to, but I did. Now I'm telling you not to, but you'll probably do it and end up telling the next guy. Lester came in as a go-between. I didn't trust Lester, and I told him. He said, believe me, I'm only doing it because they're paying me the money that they owe me from the lawsuit. I'll never come onto your sets unless you ask me. I'll never go to your dailies. If I can help you in any way, call me. In spite of this bad blood and behind-the-scenes conflicts, Donner made sure to keep spirits high on set and ensure the cast and crew were not privy to the full extent of his difficulties with the Salkinds.
It was a lonely period. It was a long period. It was tiring. It was exhausting. But I had taken on the project of making Superman, and damn it, nothing was going to stop me.
Due to the spiraling budget and delays in the schedule, it was decided to stop filming on Superman 2 and ensure the first film was completed, though this meant changing the ending. Originally, the first film would end in a cliffhanger, with General Zod and his cohorts escaping the Phantom Zone. In the sequel, Zod would end up destroying the Earth, forcing Superman to turn back time in order to save humanity. But with the movie now costing so much, the film's fate at the box office was now less certain, and so Donner decided it would be unwise to end the first film with a cliffhanger if it wasn't a hit. Therefore, Superman turning back time to save the day was moved to the ending of the first film. When it came to the special and visual effects, the first hurdle to clear was making the audience believe a man could fly. Guy Hamilton had already spent $6 million on test footage before Richard Donner joined the production, and when he viewed the flying footage, none of it was usable. Donner found a lot of the tests resembled the cheap methods used in the early black and white serials. Donner wanted something much more dynamic and believable. Director of special effects Colin Chilvers tried a number of techniques to create the flying sequences, such as a mannequin dressed as Superman fired out of a cannon and a remote control flying Superman doll. In the end, a number of different methods were used. For takeoffs and landings, the actors would be mounted on wires. Christopher Reeve proved to be an invaluable asset for these sequences, as he had taken up hand gliding as a hobby. This gave him the necessary core strength to hold himself on the wires properly and control his movements with great precision. While a lot of stuntmen trained on the wires, in the end the vast majority of the wire work was done by Reeve himself. Blue screen compositing was also used. Reeve would be suspended on wires, the camera would then move towards or away from Reeve to give the illusion of movement. The final technique was the famous Zoptic process. Reeve would be suspended in front of a front projection screen, and two interconnected zoom lenses, one on the camera and one on the projector, combined with interactive lighting and haze, would give the illusion of Superman actually flying through space rather than simply swinging on wires in front of a screen. The visual effects team also made extensive use of miniatures and matte paintings. The Golden Gate Bridge miniature was over 70 feet long and 20 feet tall. Many of the miniature matte painters also created full-scale paintings to extend the Fortress of Solitude sets, among others. To compose the music of the film, Richard Donner initially hired Jerry Goldsmith, as the two had worked together on The Omen.
When I got into this picture, I immediately called Jerry and I said, I'd love to have you do the score. So I'd love to. So we had a date set, but as the picture prolonged itself, I lost Jerry. And I said, oh God, why? I said, I'd love to go with John Williams. I wonder if we can get him. Called John Williams, sent him the script. He called, he said, I'd love to do it. I said, oh, great. I had John Williams. But then we lost him because we went past that date. We wouldn't be able to got Jerry back. And then when we just found out we were going to go for Christmas and we were going to be that much later, I lost Jerry again. Those guys were doing pictures back to back, and I got John Williams.
Williams was delighted to score the movie and aimed to create a light theatrical tone in the music.
Superman came on the screen. I swear to God, if you listen carefully, it literally, the music speaks the word. I screwed up his take because I just ran out on the floor yelling, genius, genius, fantastic. You know, the orchestra applauded him and everything. But it was, if you listen, you can actually hear the music say the word.
The film had already missed its original summer 1978 release date, and so to get the film delivered to cinemas for Christmas, Donner worked around the clock with editor Stuart Baird to finish the movie. With such an enormous amount of work still to do, shooting allegedly only finished 10 weeks before the release date, with the edit being locked only a month before release. But after a grueling production, Superman the movie was released on the 10th of December, 1978.
I'll admit there were a few problems, which, by the way, is target 0 right here.
Ooh.
When it comes to talking about this film, I see no reason why I should mince words here. I absolutely love Superman the movie. It's easily one of my favourite movies of all time, and in my opinion remains the greatest superhero movie ever made, even to this day. Not only is it one of the highest technical achievements in blockbuster filmmaking of the day, but smartly adapted and truly heartwarming in its presentation. Richard Donner's direction and Jeffrey Unsworth's cinematography is spectacular. Everything has this enormous sweeping scope to it. Krypton is spellbinding to look at, but the Smallville scenes are also gorgeous. It feels like a David Lean 70mm historical epic with its sense of grandeur and majesty. Unsworth's choice of lighting, lenses and filters also gives everything this soft, almost dreamlike look to it. It gives everything this classic 1940s Hollywood texture, but with the vibrant colours of the comic book. I think what primarily dates the movie, however, are the visual effects. Now make no mistake, the effects in this film are pretty much phenomenal. However, this did come out in the wake of Star Wars, where ILM's motion-controlled camera innovations took the miniatures, matte paintings and animation techniques of the day and elevated everything to a whole new level. Superman's effects techniques, by comparison, are much older and a little rougher. The movie does showcase many of these older techniques at the absolute top of their capabilities, but it does place the film firmly in the 1970s. That being said, the miniature work, matte paintings, and of course many of the flying scenes look terrific. The Golden Gate Bridge sequence especially is a big highlight. The 70-foot miniature looks fantastic on screen. The weaker miniature effects surround the Hoover Dam. Unfortunately, the original miniature effects supervisor had to leave early, and this sequence was completed by a different team, and it does show. When it comes to the flying sequences, the blue screen work is easily the weakest. In several shots, the colours on Superman's suit look either washed out, underexposed, or blown out, and the movements can feel a bit stiff as well. That being said, the wire work and front projection shots hold up extremely well. The first time Superman takes off inside the Fortress of Solitude and flies past camera looks incredible. Christopher Reeve looks so smooth and in control, and the way he banks his body when making turns really helps sell the effect. When it comes to the front projection work, I feel like the scenes in the California desert do look a little rough. The team who worked on these sequences always regretted using 35mm film for the backgrounds rather than 70mm, which would have given a sharper image. However, during Superman's first night out stopping crime and saving the day, all of the flying shots look great. I've always loved this shot of Superman flying away from the city. The way the lighting interacts with him is just perfect. And what is there to say about John Williams' music which hasn't already been said? While there have been some decent attempts at other Superman themes over the years, nothing has ever come close to topping John Williams' main title march for this movie. It's a spectacular piece which feels powerful, touching, and optimistic, just what Superman needs. Beyond the main theme, however, the film's score is packed with other memorable themes and enjoyable tracks. The opening track introducing Krypton might be my personal favourite. The build-up to the first crescendo is tremendous, and whenever the Krypton motif reappears throughout the film, like in the formation of the Fortress of Solitude, it's just magical. A number of tracks are also very moving. The piece which plays during Jonathan Kent's funeral is amazing, and the love theme between Superman and Lois is almost as iconic as the main march. Although the strange poem Lois says to herself during that sequence is quite bizarre. Aside from the film's technical aspect, however, what makes Superman the movie so special is that it simply nails its main character. Although I have seen some Superman fans object to the way Lex Luthor is portrayed. Rather than a mad scientist or ruthless businessman, he feels more like a Bond villain. And while I do prefer the mad scientist take on the character myself, Gene Hackman's performance is endlessly charismatic and quite intimidating. While the Bond villain influence might seem like an odd direction to go in, he's basically the coolest Bond villain 007 never had. The portrayals of many other Superman elements were also quite different than in the comic books at the time, but they were so successful it's hard to imagine them in any other way. It's easy to forget Krypton and the Fortress of Solitude taking on a crystal motif and the Superman S being a family crest were all invented for this film. But they're such great ideas and are executed so well, they've basically become the default when many people think of Superman lore. This is really the definitive origin story for the character. Despite Brando's laziness on set, the way he delivers his final words to Kal-El before sending him to Earth are really touching. The speech is wonderfully written, and the emotion of the scene is brilliantly carried by John Williams' music. Jonathan Kent dying of a heart attack, with Clark being unable to save him despite all of his powers, makes Superman as a character feel truly relatable and human. And his first appearance saving Lois from the helicopter accident is so awe-inspiring and exciting.
Easy, miss. I've got you.
You've got me! Who's got you?
I have a personal fondness for the disaster movies of this era, and so modelling Superman's action sequences after those kinds of films is something I've always felt was a very smart decision. We see ordinary people caught in the fray, pushed to the very edge of death, so when Superman finally swoops in to the rescue, it feels like a huge relief. These days online, I often see a lot of criticism thrown Superman's way, with people saying that he's too powerful and too good to properly work in a film. In response, I always used this movie as a rebuttal to those criticisms, because despite this being the first Superman movie, at the time the character was already 40 years old, and many of these criticisms are actually addressed in the film itself. The opening of the film, showing as a child reading a comic book, introduces us to a more innocent worldview, and when Superman says,
"I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way,"
Lois bursts out laughing. Which is why Christopher Reeve's performance as the character is so crucial to the film's success. Not only was he the first actor to truly distinguish Clark Kent and Superman as two completely different personalities, but it also showcases his range as an actor. The scene where he briefly switches from Clark to Superman, adjusting his posture and deepening his voice, is exceptionally well performed. It's the sincerity of the character which makes him work. The very idea of a person like Superman existing is too good to be true, and yet here he is, walking, talking, and flying exactly how such a person would. The script and direction do a lot of the heavy lifting, but none of it would have worked without Christopher Reeve in the role. This is part of the reason why Superman turning back time at the end has never really bothered me, because the emotion of the scene is so strong. Superman pulling Lois from the wreck of her car and realizing he's too late is heartbreaking. To be so grief-stricken that he's unable to let her die, to be so compassionate that he simply can't let even a single person be lost and actually have the power to put things right, is something I've actually always found to be quite beautiful. And that to me is what a great Superman movie should do. It should uplift the viewer by the end. Superman the movie more than succeeds in this regard. It embodies a sense of childlike wonder which can penetrate even the most hardened cynic. It's miraculous, not just for allowing us to believe a man can fly, but more importantly, it allows us to believe in hope. Upon release, Superman the movie was a box office smash. On a budget of $55 million, it went on to gross over $300 million worldwide, and spent 13 weeks at number 1 at the US box office. It was the 6th highest grossing film of all time, and Warner Bros.' most financially successful movie at the time. To this day, it remains the highest grossing Superman movie ever made, with an adjusted gross of $1.3 billion. The movie also received critical acclaim, with praise given to the direction, cinematography, visual effects, and Christopher Reeve's performance. It went on to be nominated for 3 Academy Awards, although Richard Donner publicly criticised the Academy for not recognising John Barry's production design, Unsworth's cinematography, or the efforts of the visual effects team. It did, however, win big at the Hugo and Saturn Awards, where the cast and the crew that were snubbed by the Academy won their deserved recognition. Following the film's theatrical run, an extended 3-hour cut of the movie was created for television in order to add more commercial breaks. In 2001, a special edition DVD restored 8 minutes of footage from this version, supervised by Richard Donner, making it the spiritual director's cut. This is my preferred version of the film as well. While it adds more action, I especially love the scene where Superman speaks to Jor-El after revealing himself to the world. It's another wonderful piece of acting from Reeve, and further serves to humanize Superman as a character. And Superman's success is also partly responsible for the later Batman in 1989 and highly influential on Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. The continuity of the movie was also recently continued in comic book form with DC's new Superman 78 series. But in 1980, the film's original and highly anticipated sequel Superman 2 would see a release. Despite the triumph of Superman's first big screen outing, it wasn't long before cracks began to show both in front and behind the camera. At the time, Superman the movie was the most expensive film production ever. However, this was partly due to director Richard Donner and the producers attempting to shoot the first film and its sequel back to back. Due to cost overruns and scheduling difficulties, filming on Superman 2 was halted in order to finish Superman the movie. After the first film proved to be such a huge hit, Richard Donner was keen to get back to finishing Superman 2. However, the film's producers, Alexander and Ilya Solkind and their friend Pierre Spengler, weren't as keen to work with Donner again. The producers clashed harshly with Donner throughout production. The director's working relationship with Pierre Spengler in particular became so bad, Donner at one point remarked, "If I see him on the set again, I'll kill him." This necessitated bringing in director Richard Lester as a go-between for both parties, which helped quell the conflict. Following the release of Superman the movie, Donner, perhaps unwisely, revealed these behind-the-scenes difficulties to the press. When asked about directing Superman 2, Donner bluntly stated, "If Spengler is on it, I'm not." He later elaborated saying, "They have to want me to do it. It has to be on my terms, and I don't mean financially, I mean control." This public lambasting of Spengler greatly upset the Solkinds, who chose to side with their longtime producing partner and friend. In an unceremonious telegram, they fired Richard Donner from Superman 2.
One came out, and I had my obligation to go back and finish 2. I mean, I was ready to go, and I get a telegram one day. It says, "Your services will no longer be needed." Richard Lester was taking over the film. I never, to this day, ever heard from Richard Lester. I was so pissed off, you can't believe it, because I was ready to go back, obviously not asking for any more money. I'd been paid. And I wanted to go back, and Tom and I wanted to go back. And Tom and I had in our minds the completion of 2. We had a great idea for if 2 went well, we could do 3, and if we did anything, we could do 4. But as I say, they chose to send me this telegram. I was ready to get on an airplane and kill, because they were taking my baby away from me. But it's showbiz, and I managed to get through it.
In his place, the Salkinds hired Richard Lester to finish Superman 2. As Donner had suspected from the beginning, the Salkinds had brought Lester in as his possible replacement. While Donner and the cast and crew harboured no ill will towards Richard Lester, Donner's firing was extremely unpopular. Writer Tom Mankiewicz and editor Stuart Baird both declined to return for the sequel out of loyalty to Donner. Instead, David and Leslie Newman were brought on to rewrite the script, and John Victor Smith replaced Stuart Baird. 2 more crew replacements were cinematographer Jeffrey Unsworth and production designer John Barry. Both men tragically died quite suddenly after Superman the movie was released. In their place, Lester hired Robert Painter and Peter Merton. Margot Kidder would later voice her own disapproval of the Salkinds' decision to the press, and Gene Hackman refused to return for reshoots under Lester, with a body double being used instead. Christopher Reeve was also apprehensive about returning. He had just landed the lead role in Somewhere in Time when he got the call about returning for Superman 2. He was concerned about exhausting himself while shooting both movies so close together, and also expressed his disapproval of Donner's firing, which prompted the Salkinds to file suit against him. During contract renegotiations, Reeve agreed to the financial terms in exchange for more creative input. Marlon Brando also refused to return for Superman 2 as he believed his contract for the first movie had not been fulfilled. He sued the Salkinds for $50 million, eventually winning $13 million in a settlement and the removal of any of his footage from the second film. Before filming on Superman 2 was ceased, it was estimated that Donner had shot roughly 75% of the film. Therefore, to gain the director's credit, Richard Lester would have to reshoot many of Donner's scenes. Lester did reach out to Donner to suggest splitting the director credit between them, but Donner declined. Lester would have to shoot 50% of the finished film to achieve sole credit. With considerable trepidation, the cast and crew prepared to complete Superman 2 under Richard Lester. Filming resumed in September 1979 at Pinewood Studios. Lester's approach to filming was markedly different from Donner's. He said, Donner was emphasizing a kind of grandiose myth. There was a kind of David Lean-ish attempt in several sequences, and enormous scale. There was a type of epic quality which isn't in my nature, so my work really didn't embrace that. That's not me. That's his vision of it. I'm more quirky, and I play around with slightly more unexpected silliness. Lester also chose to eschew single-camera shooting in favour of a 3-camera setup. This frustrated some of the actors who weren't always aware which camera was their close-up, but it did make filming go much faster, which pleased the Salkinds. Among the scenes from the original script still to be shot were the villains rampaging in the American Midwest and Superman battling General Zod in Metropolis. Choban Common in Surrey stood in for the Midwestern town, while the Metropolis scenes were shot entirely on the Pinewood Studios backlot. Because of Brando's departure, Susanna York reprised her role as Lara in place of Jor-El. While filming under Donner, Terrence Stamp, Sarah Douglas, and Jack O'Halloran took something of a method approach to their characters. They deliberately isolated themselves from the rest of the cast and crew, with Douglas and O'Halloran walking in lockstep with Stamp, even when cameras weren't rolling.
Terry had this ambiance of an actor, man. Like, you know, there's nothing that this guy couldn't do. His portrayal of Zod was brilliant. I mean, he just breathed life into Zod and made him believable.
We lived the relationship between Non and Zod, you know, and that was how we got this kind of very tight unit. I used to get Sarah to walk in my steps, you know what I mean? Or I'd have her walk, I'd hold her, and we'd walk in unison, you know, when we were going to the set, you know, I was into auras. I'd just come back from India, so what can I tell you?
When I see the film, I never see Sarah Douglas because it's so far removed, the way I look, but also the way I move. I take on another persona, and Terry was responsible for that. He said to me right from the early days that the three of us need to move together in unison. Something needs to be a bit different about us, and there's a fluidity there.
I just felt to myself, I'm the general. We were inside the White House, and I was called, and they were ready, and I could hear Jack rapping. miles away on the other side of the set, and all the crew were there. And I said, "What's happening?" They said, "We're waiting for Jack." And I thought, why, they're too intimidated to scream at him, you know. And I said, "Jack! You bastard! Get over here!" Silence. And he had these big shoes to make him look a foot taller. He had soles like a geisha, you know, and suddenly I had boom, 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 and everybody was like, and he came and said, sorry, General. Don't do that again.
For the visual effects of the film, similar processes were used to the first movie. Various miniatures were built of Metropolis for the fight between Superman and General Zod. The Zoptic process was augmented slightly. The plate photography was shot using 70mm film as opposed to 35mm film. This gave the backgrounds in the flying scenes more detail and less degradation. John Williams was originally set to return to score Superman 2. However, for some reason, he could not work with Richard Lester, their first meeting breaking into an argument. Instead, Lester brought on his frequent collaborator Ken Thorne. Thorne had a better relationship with Williams, and so he chose to reuse all of Williams' themes and motifs, reorchestrating and rearranging them. Assembling the movie from Donner's original footage and Lester's new material was a tough task, but ultimately successful. Superman 2 was released on the 4th of December, 1980. Much like the first Superman movie, Superman 2 is a film I have a lot of nostalgia for. In fact, it may have been the one I preferred when I was a child. Looking at it now, however, Superman 2 isn't as strong as the first movie, but it's still a highly entertaining, fun, and heartfelt superhero blockbuster. Although Richard Lester's sensibilities as a director don't match Richard Donner's work, that's not to say one particular style is better or worse than the other. While I personally prefer Donner's sense of epic sweep, Lester's focus on traditional Hollywood compositions and vibrant colours still makes for a great-looking movie. The visual effects are just as strong as the first film. The flying sequences in particular are actually improved. Using 70mm for the background plates makes the flying sequences look a lot more believable, and the blue screen work has improved greatly. The miniature work is also just as strong, with the Metropolis sequence being a real highlight for these kinds of effects. I do feel Ken Thorne's score for the movie isn't quite as good as Williams' work on Superman the movie. There's barely any original material here, and to my ear at least, the orchestration sounds somehow thinner. The arrangement is strong, but it sounds as though the orchestra Thorne was using wasn't as large as the first movie. It's still perfectly enjoyable music, of course, but the superior renditions of these particular themes are found in the previous film. Overall, the story of Superman 2 is very strong and well told. Lois figuring out Superman's secret identity and him giving up his powers to be with her is a bold and exciting direction to go in, which really evolves both characters. Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder have fantastic chemistry on screen, and their performances throughout are terrific. Lois comes across as less of a damsel in distress this time around, someone with real agency and intelligence. Clark Kent, meanwhile, is made all the more human and relatable. The scene where he is beaten up by a truck driver and he feels physical pain for the first time is truly shocking. The romance is also made very tragic, as we the audience know it's doomed from the start. Superman is the only one who can stop General Zod, and so when he gives up his powers, not knowing Zod has already started his campaign to take over the world, it creates this atmosphere of tension over Lois and Superman's relationship. In order to save the world, he has to give up his life with Lois. The final scene between Lois and Clark features Kidder's best performance in the two films. It's truly heartbreaking stuff.
I guess it's sort of like being married to a doctor, you know? The doctor gets waking in the middle of the night, and then the wife has to cope with the fact that he's gone.
Do you know what it's like to have you come in here every morning and not be able to talk to you? Not be able to show I have any feelings for you? Not be able to tell anyone that I know who you are? I don't even know what to call you.
Anyone who says Superman can't have relatable stories is just flat wrong. Terrence Stamp, Sarah Douglas, and Jack O'Halloran are a brilliant trio of villains. They strike that perfect balance of being over the top and campy, and genuinely threatening. General Zod is just so convinced of his own natural superiority. He walks around like he already owns the place, looking down his nose at everyone and everything.
Oh God.
Zod.
Meanwhile, Ursa seems to experience a perverse delight from terrorizing other life forms. Non is incredibly physically intimidating while also being a source of some comedy. And while the humour surrounding Non works, there are some other jokes and gags in the film which feel quite out of place. This is where I think Richard Lester's tendency for silliness hurts the film. The slapstick in the Metropolis battle conflicts with the tone of the sequence, and the strange new powers which come out of nowhere in the climax are also quite baffling. In the comics, Superman has had some very strange powers, such as the ability to shoot a smaller clone of himself out of his own hand, so teleportation and a giant cellophane S aren't too ridiculous by comparison. However, after so much great action in the movie, this climax feels contrived and confusing, as if the filmmakers were just making things up on the spot. The same can be said of the kiss which erases Lois's memory at the end. While I defended Superman turning back time at the end of the first movie as being justified by the story, there isn't really the same justification for this weirdness. Despite these problems in the third act, however, Superman 2 is still a very enjoyable movie. Superman and Lois's relationship as well as the excellent villains are easily the strongest parts of the movie. These are the elements which make it worth watching. There's also plenty of great action, visual effects and music, which make it a feast for the eyes and ears. Although it is a step down from the first movie, Superman 2 is still very much a worthy sequel. Upon release, critics and audiences praised Superman 2, with some reviews even calling it better than the original. Though there were some criticisms of the slapstick humour, the action, effects and story largely won people over. It was similarly fortunate at the box office, grossing $190 million worldwide against its $54 million budget. Though this was a far cry from the massive gross of Superman the movie, Superman 2 was still a smash hit. The film would bring in a further $60 million from home video sales, and proved Superman could continue ruling the big screen. Years after the film's release, interest grew over Richard Donner's original vision for the movie, and fans even drew up an online petition for Warner Bros. To allow Donner to produce a new cut. In 2006, Superman 2 The Richard Donner Cut was released on DVD and Blu-ray. This version restores the scenes Donner originally shot and re-edits some of Lester's footage to remove much of the comedy. The Donner Cut is often praised as being superior to the theatrical version of Superman 2, and I have to say it's praise which is well justified. In my opinion, it's still not quite as good as the first movie, but tonally it works a lot better. Watched back to back with the first movie, the pair of films feel much more cohesive in terms of creative vision. What I think holds the Donner Cut back is its jankiness. The Snyder Cut treatment this isn't. The new visual effects used for Zod's escape feel totally out of place, and funnily enough, this is the effect which is dated the fastest. The reuse of footage from Superman the movie at the end is also very obvious, and Superman once again turning back time to erase Lois's memory of his secret identity doesn't feel appropriate in my opinion. In the first film, this was an action he took out of extreme grief. It can be argued he was only able to push his powers this far because of his emotional state at the time. But in Superman 2, it really can be argued, why doesn't he just do this for everything? That being said, I do generally prefer Richard Donner's take on the Superman character. I don't think Richard Lester was a bad director in the slightest. However, it's clear Lester didn't have the same reverence or understanding of the Superman character. And so ultimately, while the theatrical cut of Superman 2 is more polished, the Donner cut is my preferred version. But thanks to Superman 2's success, Richard Lester was offered the chance to return for a third Superman film. And it's here the fallout of the Solkine's decisions would really come back to bite them. Following the end of production on Superman the movie, Richard Donner and his friend Tom Mankiewicz, who wrote the first movie, were already toying with ideas for a possible third and even fourth Superman film. Not much is known about how far Donner and Mankiewicz got with their ideas, only that Brainiac was said to be the villain. However, due to Donner's firing after the release of Superman the movie, whatever plans he and Mankiewicz may have had never came to fruition. Nevertheless, Ilya Salkind also saw Brainiac as a suitable villain for a third film, and began writing his own treatment. Salkind's treatment also added in Supergirl, Lana Lang, and Mr. Mrs. Pidlick. Supergirl would be found by Brainiac much in the same way Superman was found by the Kents, but as Supergirl grows older, Brainiac also develops romantic feelings for her, feelings which she does not reciprocate as she has already fallen in love with Superman, prompting Brainiac to use his technology to mess with Superman's personality. The climax of the movie would have seen Superman, Supergirl, Jimmy Olsen and Lana Lang all travelling back in time to the Middle Ages for a showdown with Brainiac. Supergirl would then have married Superman in either the end of Superman 3 or beginning of Superman 4. Warner Brothers, which was responsible for distribution and partial financing of the movie, rejected Ilya Salkin's draft. It was deemed too complex and too expensive. The Salkinds ultimately agreed and wanted to save Supergirl for her own solo movie. But the presence of a computerized villain, Superman's personality changing, and Lana Lang were retained for another treatment for a much cheaper film. During the development of the next draft, the producers took a keen interest in Richard Pryor after they saw his appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, in which he voiced his hype for Superman 2.
What do you go to see? Pictures, what kind? You go to see comedies mainly?
Oh, I want to see Superman 2.
Superman 2?
That's what I'm waiting on to see.
Really?
Yeah. So did you see Superman 1?
Sure.
Well, this one, remember the people was in the glass?
Yeah.
Well, he goes and gets them.
Yeah.
And brings them back to Earth accidentally. And there's 4 Supermans.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and 1 Superwoman. Oh, it's going to be good. The previews are great. We sitting in there, yeah, Soup!
At the time, Richard Pryor had made a successful leap from being a stand-up comedian to a comedic film actor. He frequently collaborated with Gene Wilder, appearing in hits like Silver Streak, Stir Crazy, and The Toy. Pryor, being a huge Superman fan, jumped at the chance to appear in Superman 3, especially after the Salkinds offered him a $5 million payday. Gene Hackman, having refused to return for reshoots on Superman 2 following Richard Donner's firing, also refused to reprise his role as Lex Luthor for Superman 3. Margot Kidder, on the other hand, had a significantly reduced role as Lois Lane in Superman 3, although the reasons why are debated. According to Ilya Salkind, the producers decided the relationship between Superman and Lois Lane had already been explored to its fullest, and wanted to give Superman a new love interest. According to Kidder, however, she believed her reduced role was in retaliation to her public criticisms of the Salkinds over Donner's firing.
They hurt my beloved Donner, and I made no bones about how I felt about it, and Christopher didn't as much. At that point, he was very aware of the politics of movie making and who you were nice to, something I never grasped. So I never had a strong sense of how to play the politics of this. I came out in the papers and said, I think they're beneath contempt as human beings. And then they put that on the cover of Time Out magazine and thus blew a lot of parts. So I come in at the beginning and I say I'm going on vacation, hi Annette O'Toole, and I go off and I come back at the end, I guess, with a tan.
Playing Superman's new love interest, Lana Lang, was Annette O'Toole. O'Toole had previously appeared in the romantic comedy Foolin' Around opposite Gary Busey and the thriller 48 Hours opposite Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy. After being cast in Superman 3, she became good friends with Christopher Reeve.
Chris Reeve invited me to his home, and he had his wife or his girlfriend and 2 little darling children, and we had dinner, and he took me to see Simon and Garfunkel at Wembley Stadium.
Wait a minute, and you didn't even really know him?
I didn't know him at all. And that was
he just
like
invites
his
you
way.
to this? Wow.
Yes. Gave me food and tickets and stuff. He couldn't have been more generous and sweet. And then on the set, and so I worked with him mostly as Clark for like weeks. We did all the Clark stuff.
Right.
And then I was coming to the set, and I was a Superman comic fanatic as a kid. I would trade the comic books. I loved Superman. So the first time I go on the set, and I didn't see him because they had a separate room for him when he was doing playing Superman, because I had a lot of different makeup and wig and all that stuff he had to put on. And so I didn't see him. And I knew I was going to work with him as Superman. I'd seen him on screen as Superman, but I hadn't. So I'm walking by we're going to the set, and the stage is really dark, and I hear this voice say, "Hello, Annette." And I look to my right, and I look at this. It was like looking up a mountain. I looked like that, and I'm not kidding. I started to kind of like stutter and got chills, and it was there with Superman. It wasn't
dressed
Chris.
up. He was
in the whole gear. And talking about it now, I get chills thinking about it.
Wow.
It was amazing because it was a thing from my childhood and from watching the movies and then from knowing him. But it was the first time I really felt like, I don't know who that is. He wasn't Chris Reeve.
O'Toole would make another appearance in Superman Mythos in the TV series Smallville, where she played Martha Kent. For the chief villain role of the movie, Robert Vaughn was cast as the scheming industrialist Ross Webster. Prior to Superman 3, Vaughn was probably best known for playing Napoleon Solo in the 60s television series The Man from U.N.C.L.E. In film, he had appeared in The Magnificent Seven and Bullet, with forays into science fiction in The Demon Seed and Battle Beyond the Stars. Playing Webster's sister Vera was British-American singer-songwriter Annie Ross. Ross's acting career up until this point had mostly been small roles in British comedies and thrillers. She had also been hired to dub over Sarah Douglas's voice in Superman 2. Serving as the Webster's sidekick would be Lorelei, played by New Zealand actress Pamela Stephenson. British comedy fans will know Stephenson from her stint on Not the 9 O'Clock News opposite Rowan Atkinson, Griff Rhys-Jones and Mel Smith. Filming began on the 21st of June 1982, once again under the direction of Richard Lester, who had completed Superman 2. Lester was a fan of putting broad comedy in his films and wanted to add in more slapstick to Superman 3. This time, no scenes were shot on location in New York, which had been used for the exteriors of Metropolis in the previous movies. Instead, all of the American locations were filmed in Alberta, Canada, in and around Calgary. The exception was Glen Canyon in Utah, which was used as the exteriors for the supercomputer base. The supercomputer itself was an enormous set built on the famous 007 soundstage at Pinewood Studios outside London. Almost all interiors were built as sets at Pinewood, including the Daily Planet and Webster's penthouse. The junkyard where Superman battles his evil self was also created on the Pinewood Studios backlot, while Battersea Power Station was used for the chemical plant. For the visual effects of the film, the same team from the previous films returned, once again making a man fly and creating the extensive miniatures and matte paintings. The animation for Webster's missile targeting system was created by Atari, which was developing a tie-in video game for the film. However, this game never actually materialized. For the music of the film, Ken Thorne returned to compose the score. Once again, Thorne opted to reuse most of John Williams' themes from Superman the movie. However, this time, Thorne also chose to mix in some synthesizers to the themes, inspired by the prevalence of computers in the plot. After a mostly smooth and somewhat lethargic production process, Superman 3 was released on the 17th of June, 1983. Although I enjoyed Superman 2 despite its faults, Superman 3 is an utterly baffling concoction. It feels like two totally different films smashed into each other. On the one hand, we have a generally interesting Superman film about his personality being manipulated by villains building a supercomputer which ends up going rogue. On the other hand is a caper involving Richard Pryor's Gus becoming embroiled in a complex financial scandal. Tones, styles, themes, and plots which have no real business being together, and the result is an awkward, slow-motion train crash of a film. Though no film is without redeeming qualities, and Superman 3 certainly has some good, even great elements. The visual effects are just as strong, with the miniatures and flying effects being better than ever. The wire work is especially good here, with some of the best in-camera takeoffs and landings ever seen in a Superman movie. Likewise, Christopher Reeve continues to excel as Clark Kent and Superman. The extra muscle mass he packed on for the film and the hints of grey in his hair create the impression of a more mature Superman than previously seen. This time around, however, it's his Clark Kent side which gets a lot more focus as he reconnects with Lana Lang in Smallville. Christopher Reeve and Annette O'Toole have an endearing, sweet chemistry between them. It's really heartwarming how Lana feels real affection towards his Clark Kent half as opposed to Lois Lane, who was head over heels for Superman. While it's a shame to see Margot Kidder so unceremoniously written off, the relationship between Lana and Clark succeeds in creating a new romantic chemistry which once again becomes the heart of the film. Which is why when Superman's personality starts to change, the way his relationship with Lana is affected feels genuinely frightening. The scene in which he ignores an emergency in favor of coming on to Lana in a truly sleazy way is really uncomfortable to watch and showcases Reeve's acting range. The rest of so-called evil Superman's antics are less effective emotionally, but Reeve is still very strong in his performance. There's honestly something quite charming about evil Superman just kind of being a nuisance, straightening the Leaning Tower of Pisa, blowing out the Olympic flame and so on. No storming the White House this time, he's just kind of a dickhead. And the climax of this subplot where Clark Kent battles evil Superman in the junkyard is a terrific sequence, simultaneously brutal and gritty while also fully embracing a surreal tone and weird atmosphere. There's also some good tracks in Ken Thorne's score. While the John Williams material is at a minimum this time around, many of Thorne's comedy and action cues are very enjoyable. The opening track does a good job of drastically shifting between different tones without ever feeling jarring. All of the music during the climax is really solid as well, building up the threat of the computer and lending the sequence a lot of excitement. Unfortunately, that's where most of the positives end with Superman 3. The main villain plot is just thoroughly uninteresting. It's clear the Websters and Lorelei are attempts at replicating Lex Luthor, Otis, and Miss Teschmacher. And while the cast take a good stab at making these characters just as charismatic and fun, the script is far weaker this time around, and they fall flat. It's Richard Pryor, though, who suffers the most. Although Richard Lester has a penchant for fun slapstick, it seems to me his comedic sensibilities don't really line up with Pryor's. As a result, it often feels like Pryor has been left to flounder on screen, improvising much of his dialogue and trying hard to make a variety of silly accents and costumes work without much success. Ultimately, both sides of the movie end up detracting from one another. The focus on Superman is lost every time the film switches to following Pryor, and Pryor feels totally out of place in a superhero blockbuster. In general, the film feels very small in scale, with very little in the way of exciting action or spectacular visuals. Although the chemical plant accident manages to recapture that disaster movie feeling of the first film, there aren't really any major set pieces until the finale. The finale itself is where things do come together. The rogue supercomputer, clearly a leftover element from the Brainiac treatment, comes out of nowhere but finally gets the movie going right before it ends. This really should have been the main villain of the movie, as it feels like a proper threat to Superman and the world. And the way it assimilates Vera always used to scare me as a child and is still very effective today. Unfortunately, a good third act isn't enough to save the movie as a whole, and in the end Superman 3 feels like a total mess with conflicting ideas and unfulfilled potential. While I don't think reverence for the source material is always essential for a franchise film's success, it's clear Richard Lester and the Salkinds didn't really get Superman the way Richard Donner did. Instead of bringing the stories of the comics to life through a blockbuster film lens, Superman 3 feels like an economical product chasing trends which have long since faded. While there are great elements within it, and I personally harbour a lot of nostalgia for the film, it's a bitterly disappointing follow-up to two fantastic preceding entries. Upon release, Superman 3 was met with mostly negative reviews. Critics lambasted the film for its pivot towards slapstick comedy and Richard Pryor's character and performance. Audiences didn't receive the film much better, with many hardcore Superman fans laying most of the blame at Richard Lester's feet. It seems this cold reception to the film also had an impact on its box office. On a budget of $39 million, Superman 3 grossed over $80 million worldwide. While overall a box office success, this was a huge decline from the financial success of the previous Superman movies. Many of the cast and crew were also disappointed in the film. Christopher Reeve especially disliked the finished product. He was originally contracted for 3 films, and after the letdown of Superman 3, he chose to step away from the role. Richard Pryor was similarly regretful. He was a huge fan of the character and initially wanted to play his role very seriously, but was instead pushed to be more comedic.
Richard was a really brilliant actor, which nobody ever gave him credit for. They just put him on a set and say, be funny. And I think Lester made a very similar mistake. He was not given the respect he deserved and had earned as an actor. I'm not sure of all the ins and outs about it. It didn't work for him on the set. He was terrified of the flying stuff, and I think he was pretty heartbroken.
While these days the movie does have some admirers, notably director Edgar Wright, it is regarded as the point where the Superman movies went off the rails. Shockingly, however, despite the critical panning, negative fan reception, mediocre box office, and disappointment from cast and crew, Superman 3 would not be the low point for Superman on the big screen. Following the letdown of Superman 3, Christopher Reeve chose to step away from the role, having fulfilled his original 3-film contract with the Salkinds. Nevertheless, the Salkinds were still confident they would one day produce a 4th Superman movie, but with Reeve for now out of the picture, they hoped to reinvigorate the franchise with a Supergirl movie. Elias Salkind had originally wanted to use Supergirl in his original treatment for Superman 3. However, after that treatment was rejected by Warner Brothers, the Salkinds decided the character would best be suited for her own solo movie.
When I auditioned for the movie, it was all the same people involved, the Salkinds and Timothy Burrell, and Alf Joint, who trained me for Supergirl. That was Chris's same guy. All the people where I learned how to fly, those were all the same people that had worked with Chris on the Superman movies. So there were a lot of similar crossover.
Starring Helen Slater in the title role and joined by Faye Dunaway and Peter O'Toole, Supergirl the movie was released in 1984. Much like Superman 3, however, it failed to impress audiences and critics alike and was a huge box office bomb. Though there is much technical competency on screen with impressive visual effects and an excellent score by Jerry Goldsmith, the story is a strange mishmash of magic, monsters, and love triangles. Helen Slater is well cast in the lead role, but unfortunately the script lets her character down immensely. Much like Superman 3, it seems the Salkinds didn't have enough faith in the source material alone in crafting the movie, instead trying to cash in on contemporary trends. It's not terrible by any means, and in my opinion fares a bit better than Superman 3, but it's a poor big screen debut for the Supergirl character.
I did a movie after Supergirl called The Legend of Billie Jean, and even in that film, they got it a little bit more right about an 18-year-old, 17-year-old going through certain rites of passage, and I felt like in Supergirl, they were shying away from it, I think just because there was so much money in the film and so much kind of expectation, they couldn't really explore a girl's journey, and my wish is that now they would revisit that kind of story and find a way to tell it with depth and humor and a story that you can actually follow.
While the Salkinds had already announced plans for a Superman 4, the commercial failure of Supergirl and Santa Claus the movie, which in many ways was attempting to replicate the success of Superman, convinced the producers the film series had run its course. Therefore, they sold the Superman film rights to Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus, the heads of the Cannon Film Group. For much of the late 70s and 80s, the Cannon Film Group had acquired quite an unfavourable reputation in the American film industry as incompetent, lowbrow schlock peddlers. With infamous flops like The Apple and Sahara under their belt, they had been sustained largely by low-budget action movies such as their Delta Force, Death Wish, and Ninja movies, with the occasional genuine hit like Break-In. However, by the mid to late 80s, Cannon had begun making attempts to move into blockbuster filmmaking, with their duo of Alan Quatermain movies, Life Force, Invaders from Mars, and Masters of the Universe. Acquiring the Superman film rights was another one of their big swings to sit at the same table with Hollywood's major studios. However, to get the movie off the ground, it was felt they needed Christopher Reeve. Reeve was still incredibly hesitant to return to the Superman role, but unfortunately his career outside the film series had never really taken off. He had largely stuck to independent dramas, as the majority of roles he was offered by major studios were shallow action movie parts he had little interest in. Therefore, when Cannon approached him with an offer to produce his passion project, Street Smart, and promised him creative oversight of Superman 4, Reeve finally agreed to reprise the Superman character. Unfortunately, due to a lack of marketing, Street Smart was yet again another flop for Cannon, although it did merit positive reviews from critics and featured a breakout role for Morgan Freeman, who earned an Oscar nomination for his performance. Even so, Cannon had held up their end of the deal, and so Reeve proceeded with the development of Superman 4. With creative control over the film's story, Reeve wanted to tackle the subject of nuclear disarmament. When consulting Richard Donner, however, Reeve was advised to keep Superman away from anything he could outright cure. Nevertheless, it was a topic Reeve was personally passionate about, and thus writers Lawrence Koner and Mark Rosenthal were hired to pen the script. Reeve also petitioned to direct the film himself, but was deemed too inexperienced, though he did direct several second unit sequences. Initially, Wes Craven was hired to helm the film, but he and Reeve didn't work well together. Reeve, who had input on the choice of director, recommended Ron Howard, but Canadian filmmaker Sidney J. Furie was hired instead. For the cast of the movie, Cannon was able to entice many of the regulars back with large pay deals, such as Margot Kidder, Mark McClure, Jackie Cooper, and even Gene Hackman. Joining the returning cast members were a number of newcomers. Mariel Hemingway as Lacey Warfield, John Cryer as Lenny Luthor, and Mark Pillow as Nuclear Man. Mariel Hemingway was an up-and-coming star at the time, with acclaimed performances in Personal Best, Star 80, and Manhattan. John Cryer was also a rising star at the time, having had his breakout role in John Hughes' Pretty in Pink. He has since reappeared in the DC Universe as Lex Luthor in the CW's Arrowverse. Mark Pillow had barely any acting experience outside of a few small television roles. However, his commanding physical presence and enthusiasm for stunts won him the part. Principal photography began in 1986. Unlike previous Superman films, Superman 4 would be entirely shot in England as a cost-cutting measure. Elstree Studios, which Cannon had bought several years earlier, was used instead of Pinewood, and the city of Milton Keynes stood in for Metropolis due to the prevalence of steel and glass buildings. It wasn't long into filming before Reeve and the others realised Superman 4 would not match the quality of the first two films. Although Cannon had originally promised a budget of $35 million, comparable to Superman 3, the company's financial troubles soon saw this budget slashed down to $17 million. While this was still enough to produce a fine film, there were no alterations made to the script to accommodate this new budget, and instead the production had to move forward without the resources it needed. Christopher Reeve later recalled, "We were hampered by budget constraints and cutbacks in all departments. Cannon Films had nearly 30 projects in the works at the time, and Superman 4 received no special consideration. For example, Conner and Rosenthal wrote a scene in which Superman lands on 42nd Street and walks down the double yellow line to the United Nations, where he gives a speech. If that had been a scene in Superman 1, we would actually have shot on 42nd Street. Richard Donner would have choreographed hundreds of pedestrians and vehicles and cut to people gawking out of office windows at the sight of Superman walking down the street like a Pied Piper. Instead, we had to shoot at an industrial park in England in the rain with about 100 or so extras, not a car in sight, and a dozen pigeons thrown in for atmosphere. Even if the story had been brilliant, I don't think that we could have ever lived up to the audience's expectations with this approach." These budget cuts severely impacted the general morale of the shoot. Reeve was left frustrated as he struggled to finish his second unit work without the resources he needed. His directing duties often had to extend to the first unit as well, as Sidney J. Furie, sick of Cannon's incompetence, essentially gave up trying to rescue the film, putting in little effort in directing a number of scenes. The situation was even worse with the special and visual effects departments. When the crew tried to explain to Cannon they didn't have the resources to create the needed shots, they were fired from the film and replaced by Israeli crews Golan and Globus had worked with on their earlier films. Thankfully, these cutbacks did not negatively affect the music of the film. Alexander Courage, famous for his work on Star Trek the original series and a close friend to John Williams, was hired to create the score for Superman 4. Like Ken Thorne before him, Courage insisted on retaining all of John Williams' original motifs and themes from Superman the movie, rearranging them and combining them with his own new material. While Courage had composed over 2 hours of music, the finished film would be cut down to 90 minutes after disastrous early test screenings. One of the many scenes cut was an earlier version of Nuclear Man who somewhat resembles Bizarro, who battles Superman in an alleyway. After production wrapped, Reeve and the others knew Superman 4 The Quest for Peace was going to be yet another disappointment, and on the 23rd of July 1987, they braced themselves for the inevitable. While I have my problems with Superman 3, at least it looked like a finished movie. A blockbuster executed to a high technical standard. Superman 4, on the other hand, doesn't even have this going for it. There is a shocking lack of polish in many scenes. The direction has no coherence, and often the staging is simplistic and dull. It makes the moments where the movie strays from boring into laughably bad at least feel refreshing. The choice to shoot in Milton Keynes wasn't necessarily a bad one, as in many shots it does indeed resemble an American city. However, on more than one occasion the reality of the locations is obvious. This shot was supposed to have a matte painting of the rest of the city, which was never finished. When Nuclear Man levitates a group of civilians, the camera pans up, revealing the entire street is simply built on the Elstree Studios backlot. And this train station is clearly part of the London Underground and not a New York-style subway. There's only so many corners which can be cut before the entire reality of a film collapses, and this is most apparent with the visual effects. In truth, there is actually some good work in here. The miniature effects are largely very strong across the board. The Great Wall of China and volcano miniatures are especially strong. However, it's the opticals and flying effects which have suffered the most from all the cutbacks. This shot of Superman flying towards camera is infamously reused about a dozen times throughout the movie. In general, all of the composited images have a washed out and flat look to them, and when it comes to the wire work, there seems to be no thought given to momentum, perspective, or movements of the people on screen. The sequence of Superman flying with Lois is full of strange speed changes between edits, and one occasion where Lois seems to be flying when she's supposed to be falling. One aspect of the movie which does excel, however, when it comes to the presentation is the music. Alexander Courage's score is absolutely fantastic. Being a huge Star Trek fan means I've been a fan of his work since early childhood, and his adaptations of John Williams' themes and motifs are brilliant. Honestly, this is probably the best the Superman March and Love themes have sounded outside of the first movie. That recognizable full sound, which I felt was largely missing from Ken Thorne's work, has returned in Courage's score. There's a kind of jazziness, for lack of a better word, to all of the brass and percussion, which really revitalizes these familiar themes. And Courage's original music for Nuclear Man, which incorporates synthesizers, is also fantastic. It's a memorable, singable theme with a textural richness which dominates the entire score. If you've never listened to the soundtrack independently of the movie, I'd highly recommend doing so. Another positive for the movie is of course Christopher Reeve as Superman. Despite the length of time between movies and his own on-set frustration, his performance is still brilliant. He pretty much carries the whole movie. Even Gene Hackman returning as Lex Luthor doesn't really satisfy. The wit of the character from the first two films is absent, meaning most of his dialogue is pretty generic, often repeating lines from Superman 1 and 2. The rest of the regulars, Margot Kidder, Mark McClure, and Jackie Cooper, are given very little to do. The same can be said for newcomer Mariel Hemingway. Lacey is just a very thin character, a simple damsel for Nuclear Man to kidnap and Superman to rescue. Nuclear Man himself fares a little better though thanks to sheer physicality. Despite being dubbed by Gene Hackman, Pillow's facial expressions and athletic ability at least makes him a memorable and threatening adversary for Superman to contend with. Even though there is so little positive to say about Superman 4, I might actually prefer it to Superman 3. Because while Superman 3 was certainly executed with more competence, teaming Superman up with Richard Pryor for a caper involving supercomputers and financial schemes pretty much doomed that movie from the start. Superman 4, however, at least has the foundation of a generally good idea. As Richard Donner advised, Superman is usually kept away from anything he can cure, but I suspect that's why Reeve saw the concept as such fertile ground for a good story. There are potential themes in the idea about Superman's hubris getting the better of him and how he needs to trust regular people more, and considering the context of his final speech at the end, I suspect this is exactly what Reeve was going for. However, either due to the issues with the script or the budget cutbacks, this arc is virtually non-existent in the final product. While the Salkinds always seem to want to restrain Superman's stories, conceptually Superman 4 aims to do the opposite. The scope of the story and scale of the action is huge, which is what makes the failures of the film a genuine shame, because if there was the time, money, and care taken with these ideas, I can see the quest for peace being a good, even great Superman story. Unfortunately, however, it was let down by its producers and shoved out the door in the hopes of making a quick buck. Even so, the legitimate strength of the ideas behind the movie have always fascinated me. And in spite of how poorly the finished film was put together, it at least means huge swaths of the film end up veering into so bad it's good territory. Watched with a group of friends and a few drinks, Superman 4 can be enjoyed. While that's a truly sad status for a Superman film to occupy, it at least makes it more fun to watch than its predecessor. In the end, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace is not just an unmitigated disaster, but a deep tragedy. The hopes of a cast and crew trying to recapture the magic of the original film, dashed by the blundering of producers who saw the Superman brand as something they could cash in on to keep their fledgling company afloat. Though it's not all bad and it can be enjoyed in the right context, Superman 4 can only be regarded as a tragic failure. Upon release, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was panned by critics and audiences alike. It grossed $36 million worldwide against its $17 million budget, possibly scraping by to break even. Today, Superman 4 is regarded as one of the worst movies ever made. However, that hasn't stopped one fan by the name of Aaron Price attempting to remaster the film by himself, restoring the cut footage and replacing many of these substandard visual effects. Some of the clips released so far have been incredibly impressive. While I don't think the available material, restored or otherwise, facilitates the film being rescued, it's certainly something I'd be curious to see should the full remaster ever come to fruition. But back in the late 80s, the failure of Superman 4 killed the Superman film series dead. The goodwill from the first entries had all but expired. It wouldn't be until 2006, 19 years later, that Superman would return to the big screen, with many hoping this would be the character's triumphant resurrection as a blockbuster icon. Following the disastrous release of Superman 4, the Superman film rights had returned to the Sulkines. Though they had initially believed the Superman films to have run their course, they had found success in 1988 with a Superboy TV series, which ran for 4 seasons, received strong ratings and critical praise. Therefore, they began entertaining the possibility of a 5th Superman movie, one which could win back audiences and redeem the franchise. The development of this movie actually managed to entice Christopher Reeve back to the negotiating table, as the Sulkines had promised a $40 million budget for the movie. Written by Cary Bates, a seasoned writer for DC Comics, Superman the New Movie, later renamed as Superman Reborn, was to feature Brainiac as the chief villain. Though Reeve was encouraged by what he saw from the Sulkines, by this time Warner Brothers had decided to reacquire the Superman film and television rights for themselves. They bought the rights back from the Sulkines in 1993 to produce the television series Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman. They also started developing their own Superman 5, based largely on the death and return of Superman story arcs from the comic books. While it's unclear whether Warner Brothers considered bringing Reeve back for the title role, in 1995 the possibility of him reprising the iconic character was lost forever. On the 27th of March 1995, Christopher Reeve sustained a catastrophic injury to his spinal cord due to an accident at an equestrian event which left him paralyzed from the neck down.
Finally, I got some information from somebody who was at the scene and said what happened was, as your horse pulled back, and I went forward, I had the great misfortune to get my hand stuck in the horse's bridle. So it's like going over with your hands tied, and that's why I landed straight on my head. 200 pounds going straight down like a nail. And then I flipped over, hyperextended and flipped over. And lay very still.
Reeve was naturally devastated in the immediate aftermath of the accident, even considering suicide, as he didn't want to be a burden to his family. While in the ICU awaiting the operation which would reattach his skull to his spine, Reeve received an unexpected visit from one of his closest friends.
They had just taken him off the heavy sedation, and I think he was just coming back. And I came in and, as a Russian, I think I was either the Russian gynecologist or a Russian proctologist. And I kind of said, oh, look at the size of this baby. And I saw he started to laugh because his eyes lit up and he knew it was me. Okay. He said that was one of the things that made him realize, he wanted to try and stick around. That, his wife, his children, and laughter and all the other things that make it worthwhile. I mean, he's got a great sense of humor about it. You have to. He has this wheelchair that's powered by breath, and he's afraid that if he sneezes, the thing will backfire and throw him out.
Reeve would later recount, "For the first time since the accident, I laughed. My old friend had helped me know that somehow I was going to be okay." In addition to other visitors, Reeve received over 400,000 fan letters from all over the world, which gave him great comfort during his recovery. After the operation was a success, Reeve was confined to a wheelchair, needing round-the-clock care and a ventilator to breathe. Encouraged by his loving wife and children, he endeavoured to one day walk again. He adhered to a demanding exercise routine to prevent his muscles from atrophying, and dedicated himself to helping other paralysed people through the Christopher Reeve Foundation, later renamed to the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. 10 months after his accident, Reeve appeared at the Academy Awards to talk about his ongoing efforts, where he was greeted by a 60-second standing ovation. His foundation would go on to raise over $130 million to fund research into new treatments and help over 100,000 paralysed individuals and their families. Doctors were reportedly astonished when Reeve was actually able to regain slight movement in his fingers and some sensation in over half of his body due to his own exercise regimen. Though he often said the Superman character was bigger than any one man, he was someone who truly lived up to that name, stepping out from the shadow of his most famous role through his own extraordinary actions. He died in 2004 from a heart attack at the age of 52. But his legacy as not only an icon of cinema, but a truly decent, heroic, and kind man lives on to this day.
Please help us conquer paralysis.
Call the Christopher Reeve Paralysis Foundation at 1-800-225-0292.
Or visit the CRPF website at christopherreeve.org.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please. Please call.
Back in the late 90s, however, Warner Brothers' attempts at getting another Superman movie off the ground proved to be quite difficult. Their Superman 5 project went through numerous script drafts which failed to satisfy studio executives, namely John Peters, who had somehow acquired the film rights from Warner Brothers in the early 90s. Peters' numerous strange demands for the film and perspective on the Superman character have been well documented by Kevin Smith, who was brought in to write a draft of the script and who renamed the film to Superman Lives, as well as the documentary The Death of Superman Lives: What Happened. This cycle of development eventually culminated in a film which would have starred Nicolas Cage as Superman and directed by Tim Burton. However, after several $1 million wasted on development costs and numerous writers and script drafts, the project was shelved in 1998. The studio would try again to get a Superman project off the ground in the early 2000s. Initially, a Batman vs Superman film was proposed, written by Andrew Kevin Walker and directed by Wolfgang Peterson, with Christian Bale considered for both Batman and Superman, as well as Josh Hartnett for the latter. Simultaneously, J.J. Abrams had been hired to write a solo Superman movie titled Superman Flyby. With his script draft seeming promising, and Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins in full swing by this point, Warner Brothers opted to cancel Batman vs Superman in favour of solo movies for both characters. Superman Flyby was to have been a new origin story for the character, and would have seen Krypton not destroyed but embroiled in a civil war. Brett Ratner was hired as director, and among those considered for the title role were once again Josh Hartnett, Jude Law, Paul Walker, Brendan Fraser, David Boreanaz, Victor Webster, and Ashton Kutcher. Ratner's preferred choice was Matt Bomer, while Christopher Reeve recommended Tom Welling, the star of the TV series Smallville. Kerry Russell and Amy Adams both auditioned for Lois Lane, while Christopher Walken was in negotiations to play Perry White, Anthony Hopkins was considered for Jor-El, and Ralph Fiennes for Lex Luthor. Eventually Ratner would drop out of the project, with McGee taking over as director. Under McGee, Shia LaBeouf was approached to play Jimmy Olsen, Johnny Depp and Robert Downey Jr. were considered for Lex Luthor, Scarlett Johansson as Lois Lane, and candidates including Henry Cavill and Jared Padalecki were in the running for Superman. McGee would later drop out of the film as the project continued to struggle. While J.J. Abrams lobbied to direct the film himself, Warner Brothers offered the job to Bryan Singer. Though not an avid comic book fan, Singer was a massive fan of Richard Donner's original Superman movie, citing it as a major inspiration for his X-Men movies. After McGee dropped out of Superman Flyby, Warner Brothers asked Singer for a pitch, knowing he had already floated a Superman movie idea to Richard and Lauren Schuler Donner, who had produced the X-Men movies. Singer's idea was to continue the continuity of the first 2 Superman films, ignoring the events of Superman 3 and 4. Superman would return to Earth after a 5-year absence, discovering Lex Luthor once again at large. Warner Brothers approved of his idea, and by July 2004, development began on Superman Returns. When it came to casting, Jim Caviezel expressed interest in the title role. However, Singer believed a more unknown actor would be better suited. Thousands auditioned for the role of Superman, including David Cudmore, Sam Heughan, and once again Henry Cavill, but eventually Brandon Routh emerged as the frontrunner. Routh had no feature film acting experience at the time. Instead, his background was mostly in soap operas, sitcoms, and teen dramas like Gilmore Girls and One Life to Live. After extensive screen tests and further auditions, Routh was cast as Clark Kent, aka Superman. To prepare for the physical demands of the role, Routh worked with movement coach Terry Notary to create a new body language for Superman. He also packed on 20 pounds of muscle. Something which no doubt helped Routh win the part was his striking resemblance to Christopher Reeve, and Singer encouraged Routh to take after Reeve for his own performance. For Lois Lane, Kerry Russell and Amy Adams once again auditioned for the role, this time joined by Claire Danes, but Kate Bosworth won out. In contrast to Routh, Bosworth had extensive feature film experience, winning acclaim for her performances in Blue Crush, Wonderland, and Bee Season. Completing the main trio of Superman characters was Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor. For the Daily Planet cast, Hugh Laurie was initially cast as Perry White, but had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts with his show House MD. He was replaced by Frank Langella. The role of Jimmy Olsen was offered to X-Men actor Shawn Ashmore, but he was too busy with X-Men The Last Stand, and so Sam Huntington was cast instead. Also joining the Daily Planet ensemble was James Marsden, known for playing Cyclops in the X-Men movies as Richard White. Rounding out the villains was Parker Posey as Kitty Kowalski, Kal Penn as Stanford, and David Fabrizio as Brutus. Stage and screen veteran Eve Marie Saint, known for her starring roles in On the Waterfront and North by Northwest, was cast as Martha Kent. Principal photography began in early 2005 at Fox Studios Australia. Over 120 sets were built across 11 sound stages. All aircraft and ship sets were built on large gimbal rigs to simulate movement. For the plane catch sequence, Kate Bosworth performed all of her own wirework stunts. Also for the same sequence, Richard Branson and his son were brought in to cameo as the space shuttle crew. The entire Kent farm was rebuilt at Breeza outside Tamworth in New South Wales. 200 hectares of corn were planted as part of the set. Stefan Bender was cast as young Clark Kent, and he too performed all of his own wire work for the jumping and flying scenes. Sydney was used to double for Metropolis, though most of the building exteriors, like the Daily Planet entrance, were facades built in front of real buildings. Superman Returns was one of the early adopters of digital cameras. Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith had already pioneered the use of digital film cameras with Sony's F900, whereas Superman used Panavision's Genesis camera. Bryan Singer's behaviour caused numerous problems during filming. He often turned up late to set and unprepared, frequently changing his mind when it came to set and visual effects design. This led to significant delays during production, which saw the budget swell from an initial $180 million to over $223 million. Only thanks to Australia's generous film production tax rebates was Warner Brothers able to bring this down to $204 million. For the visual effects of the film, ESC Entertainment, who had created the effects for the Matrix movies, was initially hired, but soon replaced by Sony Pictures Imageworks. Imageworks were tasked with creating over 1,400 shots, running the full spectrum of green screen compositing, digital doubles for Superman, and fully CG environments. The studio Rhythm and Hughes was tasked with resurrecting Marlon Brando as Jor-El for the film. Archive footage of Brando was cleverly combined with new CG lip movements to give the illusion of Jor-El saying new dialogue. To create the music of the film, Bryan Singer brought on his regular collaborator John Ottman. Before writing a single note, Singer and Ottman wanted to guarantee their ability to use John Williams' original themes and motifs, which Warner Brothers approved. Much like Alexander Courage and Ken Thorne before him, Ottman set about adapting Williams' material into a new score for the movie. For the edit of the final film, several extraneous scenes were cut. One such sequence is a haunting opening showing Kal-El returning to the ruins of Krypton. Despite costing over $10 million to produce, it was left out of the film. That expense, however, is characteristic of the production as a whole, including the development costs of Superman Lives, Batman vs. Superman, and Superman Flyby. Superman Returns cost an estimated $263 million to produce, with a further $100 million spent on marketing. The cast, crew, and studio had their fingers crossed when Superman Returns was released on the 21st of June, 2006. If it hasn't been clear to you, dear viewer, during these videos, I grew up watching the original Christopher Reeve Superman films. Much like Star Trek, I have no recollection of the first time I saw them. They were just always on TV somewhere. So when Superman Returns was released in 2006, my excitement was through the roof. And though I missed it in cinemas, by the time I finally saw it on DVD, I found it to be a real letdown. Being that I was only 11 when I first saw it, I've tried numerous times as an adult to re-watch the film and try to get what the fans of this movie see in it. Unfortunately, I have to say on my latest re-watch for this video, I still haven't really clicked with Superman Returns. Spectacular in production, but far too nostalgic of the original movie, and falling short of that high bar. Early digital cinematography certainly had a lot of teething problems, and I've always found a lot of the images in Superman Returns to look very murky and flat. When the lighting is properly implemented, it absolutely succeeds in achieving that retro-romantic look, but many other scenes seem washed out, not helped by the heavy use of green screen in certain scenes. This mixed bag of visuals also extends to the visual effects. For the most part, they're executed to a very high standard, and much of the CGI holds up pretty well to this day. However, on more than one occasion the camera gets far too close to Superman's digital double. I'm not sure why Brandon Routh wasn't brought in for these close-up shots, because the double never really convinces. Overall, the direction seems muddled. The sense of wonder so perfectly captured in the Richard Donner original is forced to contend with the dour and self-serious personal drama. A lot of this tonal inconsistency is encapsulated by the film's leads. Make no mistake, Brandon Routh and Kate Bosworth are both terrific actors, but I can't help but feel they were somewhat miscast in Superman Returns. Both of them feel far too young to be playing these characters as written. If this were an origin story, it could really work, but this is meant to be 5 years after Superman 2. I can't help but feel actors in their mid-30s rather than mid-20s would have been more appropriate here. Brandon Routh is certainly not helped by the costume design here, which I frankly think is pretty awful. The S is too small and the boots are too big, the cape is too short, and the way it joins to the collar resembles a Halloween costume. The milliskin cloth used for the bulk of the suit is clearly very restrictive, and combined with the fitting of the cape, the whole ensemble makes Routh oddly slender looking despite the amount of muscle he packed on for the role. Topped off with a perfectly rounded hair curl, and he ends up looking like someone dressing up as Superman rather than the real Superman. There's none of the gravitas which Christopher Reeve brought to the role. I also think it's unfortunate that Routh was directed to closely imitate Reeve's performance rather than making the role his own. Kate Bosworth is given a truly thankless task as Lois Lane. She isn't given any interesting or witty dialogue to say, and I feel the performance is too serious. There's none of the charisma or quirkiness seen in Margot Kidder's Lois Lane. It may seem like I'm comparing these two too much to their original counterparts, but these are meant to be the same characters after all. Most of the other cast members seem to get what kind of a film they're in a lot more, especially Parker Posey as Kitty. It's a gloriously over-the-top but absolutely sincere performance. The first half of Superman Returns is really very enjoyable. The plane catch sequence is a truly fantastic piece of set-piece action, brilliantly propelled by John Ottman's excellent score. But after the film slows down for its second act, it never really ratchets things back up again. This is where I think Bryan Singer was far too reverent of the original movie, because in many ways Superman Returns feels like a remake of the original. Once again we have Lex Luthor concocting another land scheme. Although the mechanics of the plan are different, it still results in the same kind of disaster movie set pieces which dominated the original film's climax. Here, however, these disaster sequences never really come alive. Pacing-wise, it feels like the action is constantly stopping and starting again, and despite the more advanced visual effects, none of these set pieces really feel big enough. It never really gets the blood pumping, and the climax is further let down by some head-scratching inconsistencies concerning kryptonite. When Superman arrives on Luthor's new landmass, the kryptonite seems to act as a power-off switch, but later on Superman is able to lift the entire landmass into space, still surrounded by kryptonite. It's an inconsistency which muddies the stakes somewhat. It may sound like I'm being overly negative towards the film, but as I said, I don't think it's bad overall. None of these flaws really break the film, but they do mount up and bring down the overall experience. Conceptually, Superman Returns is a brilliant idea. On paper, this is the perfect way to resurrect the continuity of the original film series, while also updating it for a modern audience. However, in execution, it doesn't quite stick the landing. Ultimately, I think it comes down to a directing problem. In other hands, I can see how the third act of this film could be truly thrilling, and the personal drama between the two leads emotionally engrossing. But it's the nostalgia for the original which clashes harshly with the 2000s network TV approach to character conflict which holds it back. It's clear the passion and enthusiasm for the material was there, but for a confluence of reasons, that passion didn't result in a great film. Instead, Superman Returns ends up being a pretty lethargic showcase of some terrific visual effects, music, production design, and a handful of good performances, but it fails in being the emotionally transcendent superhero epic it was trying to be. I know these days Superman Returns does have a lot of fans who really were able to emotionally connect with it. I truly wish I was one of those people, but each time I've rewatched it, I've never found the magic I did with the original movie. Perhaps that will change in the future, but for now, I'm sorry to say Superman Returns is merely fine. Upon release, Superman Returns was met with largely positive reviews, but there were certainly some vocal criticisms. The lack of action was often singled out as a problem, while others praised its emotional storytelling. Not outright hated by any means, but not widely acclaimed either. A similar sentiment can be applied to the film's box office. Against its $204 million budget, Superman Returns grossed $391 million worldwide. Ostensibly a success, but the massive production costs meant it wasn't as big a hit as Warner Bros. Had hoped for. Initially a sequel was in development, with Bryan Singer and a majority of the cast returning. However, as Singer's other directing obligations caused the project to be pushed back several times, several cast members' contracts expired, eventually leading Warner Bros. To opt for a reboot instead. Superman Returns' legacy does not end there, however. Brandon Routh would go on to rejoin the DC universe as Ray Palmer, aka the Atom. During the crossover event Crisis on Infinite Earths, Routh even reprised his Superman role. In my opinion, Routh's performance as the character here is a vast improvement. For one thing, the Kingdom Come inspired suit design is absolutely gorgeous looking, and Routh's maturity as an actor really makes the character his own rather than simply imitating Christopher Reeve. On the big screen, however, Superman returned in 2013's Man of Steel starring Henry Cavill. While being much more successful at the box office than Superman Returns, reception was even more divided. Director Zack Snyder's take on the Superman character has been hailed as a triumph by some and an utter misunderstanding by others. This divisiveness continued with Man of Steel's follow-up movies Batman v Superman and Justice League, which left the possibility of another Superman solo film up in the air. Meanwhile, on the small screen, Superman has met with great success in the shows Superman and Lois. Starring Tyler Hoechlin in the title role, the series has received acclaim from critics and audiences for its more grounded, family-oriented approach to the character. But once again, the Man of Steel is heading back to the big screen in James Gunn's new film slated for release next week at the time of writing. Based on the trailers, I think this movie looks fantastic. I'm not a fan of the new suit design, but in general I love how bright and colourful this film looks, and I appreciate James Gunn including so many other DC characters. Superman has always struggled to move beyond Lex Luthor and General Zod in the movies, so I'm excited to see a Superman movie featuring more of the cosmic Silver Age elements from the comics. These days, there are a lot of shallow criticisms made towards the character regarding his power level, innate goodness, and optimism. While some say this makes the character no longer relevant to today's audiences, I always argue the exact opposite. In my opinion, a sincere and hopeful Superman is desperately needed in today's pop culture landscape. Fingers crossed this year finally gives us that truly great modern Superman movie we need right now. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video and want to see more, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on future uploads. On my Patreon, you can see videos early and ad-free. The link is in the description. Thank you to all of my patrons and members, with an ultra thanks to Eamon Kelly, Michael Hardy, County Ark, Mike Halsey, Olivia Computer, Bano, Jaron Walker, Tom, Director Kate, Patrick Fleming, Matthew Camille, Lilac Yane, Ed Mark Starr, Extreme Streamers, Howard Craig Kervik, and AS Caging 101. Thank you once again for watching, and until next time, have a good one.